It is a common starting point for skeptics. The idea that the resurrection is a beautiful, ancient legend, a story that grew and transformed as it was passed down over centuries. But the development of folklore typically follows a specific pattern. For a myth to replace historical memory, you generally need a long period of time and significant geographical distance from the original event. You need the original generation of witnesses to pass away, so the story can be reshaped without being challenged. The Christian claim, however, appeared almost immediately. It wasn't whispered in a distant land decades later. It was preached publicly in Jerusalem, the very city where the execution occurred, while the people who witnessed the events were still walking the streets. When Catholics examine this claim, they don't rely on a single, isolated proof. Instead, the approach is one of evidentiary convergence, looking at how several independent historical data points intersect at a single conclusion. This immediate and public emergence in Jerusalem creates a problem for the legend theory. It suggests that whatever happened was powerful enough to take root in a place where it could have been easily disproven, demanding a more rigorous explanation than simple folklore. Consider the proximity of the first written records. This timeline shows a creed quoted by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. Most scholars trace this specific tradition back to within just a few years of the crucifixion itself. Compare that to the centuries usually required for normal legends to take shape. Such a narrow gap means the resurrection wasn't a later addition to the faith. It was the very core of the message from the start. Then there is the burial site. Every early account, regardless of its source, records that the tomb was empty. Historians look for details an author wouldn't likely invent if they were trying to be persuasive, a concept called the criterion of embarrassment. In these accounts, the first witnesses to the empty tomb are women. In first-century Jewish culture, a woman's testimony carried very little legal weight. If the story were a fabrication designed to convince the public, the authors would have chosen highly respected men as their primary witnesses. Including women suggests they were simply recording what happened, however inconvenient. If the body had remained in that tomb, the Roman and Jewish authorities could have ended the movement instantly by producing it. Instead, Christianity began and grew in the one city where its central claim could be most easily falsified. The evidence also includes a series of specific mass appearances. The early records claim that the risen Jesus was seen by Peter, the 12 apostles, a man named James, and a crowd of over 500 people at once. This network represents those mass sightings. When Paul wrote about the 500 witnesses, he explicitly noted that many of them were still alive. By pointing to living witnesses, Paul was essentially inviting his readers to go and talk to them. This is the language of public verification. He was providing a list of people who could be cross-examined to verify the account. Some suggest these were hallucinations born of grief. But hallucinations are internal, individual experiences. They do not happen simultaneously to hundreds of people in a group setting, which makes a psychological explanation difficult to maintain for these mass sightings. Because these claims were made so publicly, involving so many available witnesses, the movement was vulnerable to exposure, yet it did not collapse, it expanded. Perhaps the most striking piece of evidence is the radical change in human behavior, particularly in the case of Paul. He began not as a follower, but as a violent persecutor of the early church. Approaching Damascus to arrest more Christians, Paul claimed a direct encounter with the risen Jesus, an event that completely reversed his life's mission. Paul wasn't grieving for Jesus or predisposed to believe in him. He was actively working to destroy the movement, which makes a subjective vision or a longing for hope an unlikely explanation for his transformation. The original apostles also underwent a profound shift. They went from hiding in fear to facing beatings, imprisonment, exile, and eventually martyrdom for their claims. People often die for things they believe are true, even if they are mistaken. But people do not willingly endure torture and death for something they know they invented. The fact that both hostile enemies and fearful followers were suddenly willing to face execution for the same claim suggests they were responding to something they were convinced was a physical reality. Think of a trial. While a single witness might be mistaken, When several independent types of evidence all point toward the same conclusion, the collective weight of the case changes. You have the tight timeline of the records, the physically empty tomb, the sudden conversion of enemies, and the testimony of hundreds of witnesses. This convergence is why the Catechism of the Catholic Church, in paragraph 643, states that these testimonies make it impossible to regard the resurrection as a purely spiritual metaphor. From this perspective, the evidence requires it to be acknowledged as a historical fact. Legends do not usually begin immediately, transform enemies, empty their graves, and create martyrs in the very city where the death occurred. Because the historical data points toward a physical event, Easter is not viewed as a mere symbol of hope. It is seen as the event that redirected the course of the last 2,000 years.